Hey everybody, what's going on? So I was just about to say my idea to Tim. Welcome in everybody who's listening. We're going to try something a little bit different. For the last few weeks, Tim and I have been coming on here and basically teaching. And we'll come on here, we share stuff that we feel confident talking about, things that we've both done a fair amount of like learning on over the last several years. And that's been great. But here's the deal. I don't want to speak for Tim, but like there's a limited number of topics that I am qualified to talk about week to week. And so we would run through those pretty quick.
Yeah.
And more importantly, like we both spend our entire weeks learning. And so what we want to try for at least the next couple of weeks, rather than coming in with like a specific program in mind of something that we want to convey, we've started just collecting things that Tim and I are learning over the course of the week and that we want to share with each other. So he's got a couple of ideas that he brought to the table, that things that he's kind of figured out or stumbled across, cool stories that he's found over the last, I guess, 2 weeks now. Yeah. So the goal is that rather than sitting down and just making this like a course on content or something like that, you know, we're going to keep learning and you can learn alongside us rather than from us. We're going to give that a shot. So you can let us know what you think. Over the last 2 installments of us kind of sitting down and teaching something, we were working our way through this 3-part framework of growth, where the first lever is free growth techniques, and then we went through paid. And we've said a couple of times that third lever is audience-based growth. And so I would love to start this episode by just closing the loop on that and talking through that for a little bit. And then kind of we can dive into some other stuff. Are you cool with that?
Totally cool with that, especially because this is one of the things that I was most excited to hear from you, because this is one of the levers that I have very little experience on and you have like a ton of experience on. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess just following up what you said, when we started this podcast, we made a deal to ourselves to have a good time doing it. I loved last week's interview with Kay. I had a blast doing that. I felt so inspired afterwards. You know, we're going through things that we have learned, but there's so much more that we can learn. And so it's just, we're going to like learn some of this in public and be able to share it with our listeners. So definitely let's close this one out. Talk to me about the audience lever.
Yeah, sure. So I had the opportunity to sit down with Louie Nichols over at SparkLoop.
I love that dude.
Yeah, he's great. For anybody who doesn't know him, Louie's a co-founder of this software called SparkLoop. It's a growth. Basically, it's like a referral growth marketing platform. So if you run a newsletter, you can basically sign up for SparkLoop and they'll help you with everything you need to run a referral program. And they run, you know, like 7 of the 10 largest email referral programs in the industry. A lot of companies like The Hustle or Morning Brew built their own, you know, from scratch, but SparkLoop runs the rest. And I like Louie a lot because he has a very unique position in the industry. Like Morning Brew's referral program is probably the biggest, if I had to guess, probably the biggest in the industry. And everybody who works on it knows like what it took to build that, but they only know what it took to build that.
Yeah.
But Louie's behind the scenes on all of these different referral programs. There are very few people probably in the world who have seen the data behind as many referral programs as he has, just because, you know, his software runs all of these. And so he's a really cool guy to talk to and really get down to the nuts and bolts of like, how does this really work? Because there are ideas on how this works, and then there's the reality. So I want to dig into, he said some really interesting things. I want to dig into some of what I learned from him and break this down into something that people can digest. But the first thing I'll say is that, you know, anybody who's listened to the last episode right before our interview with Kay, one of the examples we used for paid marketing was the referral program or the giveaway that Noah Kagan did. And that's true. It is paid. What I want people to maybe think of as we start talking about this audience-based growth is that it builds on the 2 buckets that came before. So for everybody, in case you didn't hear, the first lever that you have at your disposal for growing anything is like free marketing tactics. And the big idea there is you're trying to do things that get other people to talk about you. That's free. Paid takes that to the next level by, you're now spending money to acquire people. And again, kind of the big philosophy or the keystone tactic there is you need to make sure that you're acquiring people at or below a certain cost so that you can grow profitably. When you get into this audience range, what you're looking at is like how the culture that you build with your audience facilitates your future growth. Okay, so then let's get into some of the things that he's taught me about this, because again, I think this is kind of a black box for most people, but he was really generous with his time. I guess the one disclaimer I'm going to give up front is that Louie's pretty precise in the way that he talks about referral programs. So if there's anything that you hear here that you either don't agree with or disagree with, just assume it was like a misinterpretation on my part, not his, because there are some things like where I think the words he might choose would be a little bit different, but I'm going to give you kind of my take on our conversation. One of the first things that we talked about was the economics of how these work. And there are a few questions that I think a lot of people bring to the table when they're thinking about doing a referral program. One is like, how big does my audience need to be in order for that to make sense? And then another that maybe people don't typically ask out loud, but it's really important, is what should I be shooting for in terms of success metrics? I think there's kind of an unspoken assumption among certain builders that if you build this thing right, most of your audience is going to participate. And I was really surprised because he told me that's not even close to true. Wow. So here's some of the concrete numbers that he brought to the table based on all these other successful referral programs. First of all, when to start it, he says there's a point at which it's a no-brainer, right? Like you should just have one in place because it's going to help you if you are beyond the 30, 40, or 50,000 subscriber mark. Once you're that big, as long as you kind of set up the incentives correctly so that you're not like losing money on acquisition, there's no reason not to have the referral program in place. At least that's seems to be his take. You can start it earlier, but like if your audience is super small, it may not make sense. One thing that he said was that it can be incredibly beneficial early on if your focus is not necessarily on getting as many people as possible, but on creating the culture of sharing inside your newsletter. Sure. That's like the reason to start early. If you're going to start before like 30, 40, 50,000, you're going to start any smaller than that. Do it with the intention of making some kind of like cultural shift inside your audience. We could talk about ways that he suggested to do that in a second. But that first question, how big do I need to be? 30, 40, 50,000. Before that, you either don't need it or you should step into it very thoughtfully with a specific cultural goal. And then how many people are going to partake in it? Get this. He said, based on what they've seen, the typical referral program sees about 5% of readers attempt to make a referral. That's not even the number of people who actually make a referral. It's the ones who like send their link out or get people to click on it. 5%. And he says, if you want to be really ambitious, you can aim for 10%, right? So you strive for 10%, but on average, you're going to be seeing somewhere between 5 and 8%. And I think that's really important for people to understand, because if you are seeing those numbers already, like, you're in a pretty good spot. Mm-hmm. And then also, not to be holding out for like 80 and 90% participation. And you can sort of plan some of your promotions with those numbers in mind. And again, if you're only aiming for like 5%, or if you can expect 5% to be engaged, that helps explain why you're probably going to want to wait till this 30, 40, 50,000 person mark, because any lower than that, and it's going to be very hard to see any significant rise. So I have some like examples on how to go about maybe selecting and structuring the incentive package, but I wanted to pause there for a second and just see, how does that land with you? I mean, based on what you've seen, have you guys ever run either a giveaway or a referral program?
We're going to put SparkLoop on the Copyblogger email list on March 1st. That's why I was just talking to Louie. But on Unemployable, which is Clark's other brand that he's been building, like kind of his little side project, him and Jared do it. And they showed me some really, really great numbers about how effective SparkLoop is. In terms of 5%, I don't feel like that's that low. That's kind of what I would expect it to be. I think the idea with the referrals is that it's the same as everything else. It's a compounding effect. So it's just once you have it running week in and week out over time, it's not necessarily 5% of like a static amount, it's 5% of a growing amount, which grows on top of itself, which grows on top of itself until it scales. So that's really the power with the referral programs is the compounding on them.
Yeah, totally. And within that 5%, there's basically two different types of people. So the vast majority of your referrers are going to make one referral.
Yeah.
Right. Which is interesting also, because if you look at like the bottom of any newsletter today, you'll see these referral prize categories, for making 3, 5, 10, 50, 100, 1,000 referrals. The vast majority of people will only ever make one referral.
Just one.
Yeah. And one of the things Louie said was, okay, well, when you're planning, then you sort of take this barbell strategy where you are, on the one hand, you structure the low end of your incentive package to draw as many of those one referral people as possible. So super low barrier to entry. I think he recommended somewhere around like 2 to 3 referrals. You need to make 2 to 3 referrals to get that first prize, right? And then you have to make that prize good enough where people are like, they want it, right? Mm-hmm. And what you're trying to do inside of that is really just optimize the number of people who try to make that one referral. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you will inevitably have a handful of people in your audience who are like the whales. And they kind of come in 2 flavors. There's the person who is inherently motivated by games. By the way, this is where I think that Louie and I would disagree on the verbiage. So this is my take on it. You have people who are inherently motivated by the referral program itself. And like they could go buy a mug with your logo on it, but they would much rather win it, right? That person. And I use the word game to describe that because it's kind of like game theory type thing.
Yeah.
Then you also have the readers who have their own big audience. And again, if they see, some prize that's really cool up at like the 100 or 1,000 referral mark, and they think by the sheer nature, the size of their audience, they could kind of get like an easy win on that, you'll incentivize them to act as well because they know they could hit that. Whereas the average person, it's hard pressed to find like 1,000 people they could refer you to. So that's kind of the barbell strategy. On the one end, how many people can you get to make that one referral? On the other end, how can you get those few people really excited about either exposing you to their big audience or hustling in order to hit this referral count? And he had some tips for that. So one thing that's probably counterintuitive, he said, focus more on the inherent value of what it is you're offering rather than the price point. So there's like some people who, they'll give away a Tesla or they'll give away a Peloton bike or something like that. And those can be, those are pricey prizes if you're not working with some kind of partner. But he said, so I don't know if I should name drop this. He described an example of one particularly well-known author in the tech and business space who only works a handful of hours per week and describes in several books how to make that happen for other people. And when I say a handful, it's less than the number of hours you could count on one hand. So this person runs their referral program on SparkLoop, or at least did, and was experimenting with different giveaways. One was giving away he said basically some kind of electronic device. It may be, I don't know if this was it, but maybe like an Apple notebook or something like that. Something that was flashy that everybody kind of thinks is cool and wants. That campaign performed okay. It was like, all right. But then Tim came back and said, let's just give away like 50 signed copies of this book. So 50 signed copies of his own book. And when he did the signed copies of his own book, that campaign performed 5 to 10 times better than
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Because I would be so much more motivated to get a signed copy of the book rather than an iPad.
And that's the thing, even though it's way less expensive, right? Like you go to a book signing and you could get a signed copy for maybe $5 more than whatever the cost of the book is. But the issue is there's no other way to get it, right?
Totally.
So I thought that was a good tip. Don't necessarily worry so much about how much money you're spending on the incentives. Instead, focus on like what's the inherent value or the sort of I don't know, like
the rarity
value. Yeah,
for sure.
There were a couple other things we talked about that I'll throw them out here, and then we won't belabor this point too much longer. But I hope these are helpful for people again, because Louie has insight that most people never get on this process. So, a few other things related to how to set up the prize frameworks. So, one thing he took me through is he said there's basically 3 types of incentive packages. So this is the one most people are probably familiar with. If you refer 3 people, you get, a mug, 5 people, you get stickers, whatever it is. And that goes up and up and up. And the deal with that is it's kind of ongoing. So if you refer those people over the course of a year, you're still going to get those prizes. That's the milestone program. Then there's 2 others. One is like a time-bound giveaway, where we'll say, hey, this month we're giving away a Peloton bike or 50 signed copies of a book. To each referral you get 1 entry, and then we're going to draw 50 names or something like that. So a time-bound prize draw giveaway. And then the third is like a first across the finish line. So it would be something like for the first 5 people to refer 10 members are going to get, one-on-one with the founder or something like that. What's interesting about these is that they each incentivize a different type of action for a different type of audience. So like the first across the finish line is really designed to appeal to those people who have the audience that we talked about earlier, because they're like, oh, well, I know there's like, maybe there's 100,000 people who read this newsletter, but most of them are not going to have as much reach as I do. And so I think I can reach whatever, 10, 20, 50, 100 people before anybody else can. And so it's kind of set up to optimize for that far left end of the barbell that we talked about. Whereas the other, like the milestone, is almost the exact opposite, right? So if you have a large audience, milestone programs remove any fear that somebody's going to put in effort and like not see a payoff. Sure. And so his kind of final takeaway was, what's the best setup? The best, like where you're going to see the best performance is actually combining the 2. So an ongoing milestone program coupled with some kind of giveaway every 1 to 2 months, whether that's time bound or first across the finish line, something like that. And then in terms of choosing those prizes, okay, that's kind of the end for Louie. Although he did say this, like when it comes to choosing the prizes, a couple of things to think about would be like, first, how many people are you sending this referral program out to, right? So how big is your audience? How much do they want the prize? Then here's the really important one. How many other people like them do they know? Because if you have a program like Morning Brew, which is like, college kids who read finance stuff, it's pretty easy for those readers to find somebody else to share it with. But if you run, like a newsletter for divorce attorneys or something like that, maybe they know a couple of other ones, but they're not going to know a whole bunch. Most of them won't know a whole bunch of other people who need that product. So when you're thinking about whether or not to use a referral program or like audience-based growth methods, it's important to consider how many people in your audience know other people like them.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I never would have thought of it like that too, because you could have a group of 100,000 people, but those 100,000 people might be in some kind of clique that doesn't necessarily incentivize that they all know each other, right? As opposed to, like you said, Morning Brew is a great example because like all college kids know other college kids. Right. But I mean, I guess divorce attorney is a pretty good example. a divorce attorney probably knows a handful of other ones just from the industry, but they don't hang out in like, dorm rooms with divorce attorneys.
Yeah. Yeah. There's probably some other version of that too, where it's like people are actually negatively incentivized to share because
Exactly.
they're competitors, right? And they want to have
Exactly.
kind of the inside track. So he mentioned a couple of newsletters that I'll mention here because they're doing a particularly good job of this. So the first is Brennan Dunn, who writes a newsletter called Create and Sell.
Yeah, the right message guy.
You know?
Yeah, yeah, of course. He did. I've never spoken to him, but I know him and I think he knows me. He's got a really cool software called Right Message. It's Right Message has been way too sophisticated for me. Like I'm just I'm good with like a couple lead forms and funnels on ConvertKit, but Right Message is really, really cool. And I know that Louie uses Brennan's newsletter as like a case study pretty often because Brennan is like highly sophisticated in how he segments his audiences and stuff. So I think he'd be a really good example.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the thing he pointed out to me was he said Brennan does a good job of like writing in a way that's tweetable and then making sure some of those pull quotes, the button is right there to tweet it. So
Yeah.
he'll write, and I thought that was brilliant because I'm like, oh, of course, you're putting all this time into content, but why don't you make sure that the content itself is super, like makes somebody else look smart by sharing it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess Brandon does a good job of that, which is cool. So he's one. And then I might pronounce her name wrong, but I think the other is Leda Solis. She writes SEO FOMO, which is a newsletter. And
Oh no.
apparently she's just quite good at the cultural side of things. So like calling people out, saying thank you, displaying who the highest sharers are, and really creating a culture of sharing inside her newsletter, even though it's on the smaller side for now. So those are a couple to check out if people are really interested in this. But basically, that is most of what I've found researching referral programs. The only thing that I would add to it is when you look at a milestone program. In the past, I've referred to this as a game, and I think that's a term that Louie might disagree with, but I use it to mean something like I think you can think through these programs using the principles of game theory, which speak to like the motivations of people involved and how they'll react in different circumstances in order to maximize your chances of success. So one thing when it comes to incentive structures that is really important that I think it often goes missed is if you build it right, ideally your cost per acquisition should go down as somebody continues to move up through the ranks of your incentive structure. So if you look at like, let's say somebody giving away stickers as their first reward and then maybe a keychain and a mug. If you look at the cost that you pay for each of those prizes and sort of total it up and divide it by the number of new subscribers you're going to have as a result of that referral program, as somebody works their way up the chain, your cost per acquisition should go down. Ideally, I think that's something that often gets overlooked because people just think of it in terms of like, well, what do people want? What's going to motivate people? But there's a business side to this too that often gets missed. So that's the one other thing that I would add. Again, I don't think Louie would disagree with the economics, but I've in the past he's objected to the term game, so I don't want to put that word in his mouth. But that's how I think about this. Yeah, he was really generous. So if you are interested in more on this, probably go check out. I'm sure SparkLoop is like publishing cool stuff about this as well.
They got a pretty cool blog. Yeah, just go follow Louie on Twitter. He's very similar to you in that a lot of what he tweets about is specific to newsletters and about email publications as opposed to, I guess, what you could call like traditional email marketing. He likes newsletters in the same way that you do. So yeah, he's really cool. It's a great software and Louie is super fun.
All
Is
right.
that what you got on here with insider tips from so and so's referral programs? Is that where this was inspired from?
Oh yeah. Do you feel like I covered that? Did I get enough from the
Definitely.
specific referral
If there's
programs?
only one thing to add, I think I would add that referral programs are very simple. I find one of like the educational barriers with the referral program is setting it up and people think like it's a really good idea. And then when they get to setting up, they kind of freeze. But it's like a super, super simple software. And especially if you use it with ConvertKit, there's even a layer of ConvertKit that SparkLoop basically comes with the tier, like one of the higher tiers. And so it's already baked into the software.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's like it's so easy to set up and so worth it. And there's nothing but upside from it. So yeah, I mean, geez, it makes perfect sense to me just in terms of the behavior of certain people. I mean, it's the same as everything, right? You're going to have a few people that the majority of the people are going to do it one time. And then you're going to have like a set of outliers who generate the vast majority of your referral subscribers. So that's the barbell you're talking about. And then there's the behavior of the subscribers themselves, which is what we talked about in terms of the people in your email list who know other people like them in your email list. And I think with those two things, if you have an audience that is potentially full of other people who also have audiences, that's the real ticket to this tier 3 layer of using other audiences to grow. And so I think that wraps it up nicely. You know, we went through what I feel like is my comfort zone, which is basically the free, you know, the long, slow, but scalable trek through through like the world of the internet, building an audience. We have the paid model, which we went over some cool stuff last time, but traditionally, let's just call it advertising. I think you're right. I think like what Noah does with the giveaways is a little bit more along the lines of, it's kind of like a hybrid between the paid and then like the leverage audience. And then the third tier, which is using the people that already follow you to get people to follow you. And with those three things combined, I think anybody can build some kind of following that can provide like a legitimate income for them to live and thrive off of. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's brand is going to be doing 20 million a year, right? But I just really think if there's one theme in the show is that every hobby, every interest has a community around it. And if you have engagement around a community, then that means you have like incentive. And if you have incentive, then that means you have willingness to buy shit, basically. So if you follow those three things, I mean, really, you can't lose. You might stumble along the way and fall on your face a couple of times, like all of us have. But I still really, really believe that if you just stay after it with consistency, like you can't fail. And so anybody listening over the last couple of weeks, you know, we talked about some real technicalities here, but it's pretty simple. Pick a lane and do it for like a couple of years. And it's, you know, nothing in life is a guarantee, but there's a part of me that always feels like if you just do it, it will definitely work. You know, like it will absolutely work. Just keep going.
This is not guaranteed, but
yeah,
it will definitely work. All right. That was a good way to wrap that up. Now you've got a couple of things on this sheet that I'm dying to hear about.
Cool.
And I'll let you pick whichever one you want to go with. So there's two here. For people who are listening, we basically structured this like we've got a sheet. It's a shared spreadsheet. And we stole this idea from Sam and Sean over at My First Million. We basically drop ideas in here in a way that like it's supposed to be like the hook. So I have no idea what he's about to talk about, but both of these sound very interesting. One's how ConvertKit went from 1,500 MMR to 100K MMR in 12 months. And then the other is what is the Outlier algorithm? Which one of those do you want to do?
You know, I'm really excited about the Outlier algorithm. I think I was really excited to share Nathan's Twitter thread about this one specific tactic he used, but I'm going to save that for next week because I found this article called the Outlier algorithm. Well, actually, the title of the article, hold on, it's in my Rome account. While most people fight to learn, quote, in-demand skills, smart people are learning rare skills instead. So I found this article that absolutely fascinated me. It's written by a guy named Michael Simmons. He's a writer on Medium. If you just Google Michael Simmons, he's got 63,000 followers on Medium, and he writes for Entrepreneur Magazine. He's written for Time, Fortune, and Harvard Business Review. I even followed up with him on Twitter. He and I are going to chat on Monday. He said he's interested in some automation type stuff because I was such a fan of this article. So the Outlier algorithm is is a philosophy basically that in order to be massively successful, you have to find the things that nobody else is good at and typically won't succeed. Because if you do what everybody else is doing, you're going to get what everybody else gets. But the problem is what everybody else is doing statistically is usually accurate. And so how is it that you find those outliers, which statistically will be wrong, but every once in a while will be right? And like the tremendous upside on finding that algorithm, on finding that one advantage. So here's a couple quotes from it. And these are quotes that I think a lot of people have heard before, but these are just dots that have connected for him. He was looking at realtors that had found significant upside over a significant amount of time. So they weren't just one-offs. They were people that like proved to have success in the long game. Okay, you want to be greedy when others are fearful. You want to be fearful when others are greedy. It's that simple. Quote by Warren Buffett. This is a quote by Howard Marks. He's the founder of Oak Tree Capital. In order to get to the top of the performance distribution, you have to escape from the crowd. Okay, so it's a lot of contrarians, more or less. Here's a quote from Peter Thiel. The best projects are likely overlooked, not trumpeted by a crowd. The best problems to work on are often the ones nobody else even tries to solve. And so there's a theme here because there's a reason why nobody else is trying to solve these problems, because statistically speaking, these are problems that won't necessarily, that solving them won't have an upside, but one of them, a few amount of them will have a tremendous upside. Okay, and so here's the really cool part. This is the outlier algorithm. To put simply, each of these innovators and investors are saying you should focus on investments that are rare and valuable. In other words, you should focus on the star below if you want big profits and impact. So clearly this article was written under the context of investing, but the philosophy shows with anything, with writing, with content marketing, with business, with sports, with just exceptionalism of any kind. So it's kind of like a matrix basically, and the top right is in a star, which is rare and valuable. Because if you're in the top left, you can be rare but not valuable. I'm trouble thinking of an example, but there's also something that is not rare and not valuable. But then this is the tricky one, valuable but not rare. And so here's the example that he was using. Let's say you have a disease that is terminal and will definitely kill you. It's like, well, what are you willing to do in order to get that disease cured? You'll do anything, right? Because it's your life. Of course, you got to do anything or else you're going to die. But what if the cure to that disease is very, very common? You know, let's just say, I don't know, let's say you have scurvy, right? And then you find out that all you got to do is eat an orange. You know, it's like, that's a very, very valuable thing, but it's not rare. And so this is the one that's the trap, the valuable but not rare. And I was thinking about this so much with Twitter, with just social media in general. In some cases, I was even like reflecting on myself as somebody that's been like such an advocate for long form writing. Luckily, long form writing, I think, is still rare because it's so difficult to be a good writer, but content creation is not rare, you know? So this is still the avenue for like exceptionalism where, yes, there's a lot of written content out there. There's a lot of content in general, but there's still only a very, very small amount of like highly, highly valuable written content. And so this made me feel good. Okay, so here's the algorithm.
Can we pause on this for just a second before we go on to the algorithm? Or wait, what is the algorithm? To be is that one sentence there?
Yeah, to be an outlier, you need to be a contrarian who is smarter than the market.
Okay, let's pause on this idea for a minute and dig even deeper, because there's a couple of things that you said that I think are worth pointing out or double clicking on. So for anybody listening, we're looking at like an Eisenhower matrix, right? And Tim said on the one hand, the binary is something rare or not rare. And then on the other axis, is it valuable or not valuable? What I think is interesting is when you really get into it, any particular skill can be shifted around this matrix depending on the times, and then also like how you couple it with other things. So as you said, content creation is still rare and valuable long form content is rare and valuable under some circumstances. And I would go so far as to say that if you were to couple that with something else, you can actually boost both of those aspects, right? Like long form content on Web3.
Yes.
Which is becoming less rare. But the reality is by stacking different rare traits on top of each other, you can kind of build this moat and protect against any kind of slip where something may suddenly become more available. I think niching down is a really interesting example of this. Like, again, Web3 is one example, but like you gave this example in one of our early episodes. You said that one of your first jobs was doing product reviews for like a patio furniture company. And ever since then, that struck me as such an interesting example of a niche because it's something that nobody would think of when they were except somebody who literally runs a patio furniture store. Nobody else would think to go specialize in that, but you could. And because nobody else is doing it, if you write good copy and you specialize in that industry, you are the rare, valuable copywriter. So I think there's ways to use this to your advantage, even if the thing that you're going after isn't necessarily perceived as valuable or rare by the broader market, just by niching down or stacking skills on top of each other. And then one other thing that I'll just say, I really like this model and this idea. It reminds me of I think this might have been Naval, who said, if you want to make outsized returns in investments, there are basically two factors at play. Are you right or wrong in your thesis? And are you in consensus or out of consensus with the rest of society? Because if you're wrong, it doesn't matter either one, right? You're not going to make money. But if you're right and you're in consensus with everybody else, you're also not going to make a lot of money because everybody thinks the same thing you do. So similar to what you're saying here with like, you have to be focused on rare and valuable. I think if you want to make large returns at any point in your career, it's important to think through this lens of like, what's rare and valuable? And then like, what am I right about that everybody else disagrees on? And then go follow that.
I totally agree. I'm going to stop the screen share for a second and talk personally about it. The reason why I sent this guy, Michael, the writer, a message on Twitter was because it struck me at such an important time. I mean, I've been in Miami. I've been here for a month. I got the beach and got some time to like reflect and think. We've been making we talked about this last week with Kay. I've been making some real internal changes with my company where I'm basically centralizing everything. And it's very uncomfortable for me because I've built all of these like other independent brands that I'm now just bringing all under one roof, And it had me thinking about like, what am I now if I am not the content person in my company? And I wouldn't call it an existential crisis by any means. I was just sort of thinking like the last 10 years of my life has been focused on a rare and valuable skill where I've more or less been like the nation's leading expert in long form written content for the addiction treatment industry. Like I can't think of anybody in the world really that has more experience at this one very rare but very valuable skill. And so now, if I'm not going to be focused on that anymore, I was just really thinking like, where am I going next? And I've been having such a good time with automations and with sales funnels and with copy. And I've been really tinkering with it, like having just a great time with it, experimenting. And when I read this article, there's a part at the very end of it that I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it really was like a ding ding moment for me. I was like, oh man, so the next 10 years, I think me personally, I'm dedicating fully on segmenting and automation because I know that the scale of, or excuse me, the skill of creating an audience, quote unquote, isn't as rare and valuable as it used to be. Because the way the economy is going, like everybody needs to have a following in one way or another. Like we're all our own mini economies now. Like we're all so long-tailed, more or less, where we all belong to such like micro communities because of the internet. And so if my skill, I don't want to say not very, like I'm not trying to underplay what I do. I'm just acknowledging that things evolve, and what is the next like 10 years going to be like for me. And I had this realization that, man, like that's my move. I know how to drive traffic. Like I really do. I know how to drive traffic to an audience. I know how to collect emails, and I know how to drive leads also. But after that, like what happens after that initial point of contact? And that really, really is where like the money is made, because that goes from interest into taking action. And so, yeah, like I know I'm speaking a little bit personally of it, but I just had this realization like, damn, this is where I'm going to be for the next 10 years. Like I'm going to master this rare and valuable act of automating sales copy, so that that laborious process that at one point used to take like dozens of phone calls and hundreds of emails back and forth and customer service can just be all completely automated. And now, man, like with Zapier and ConvertKit and Podia and Thrivecart and all the integrations going on, I'm having such a blast with it. And I really feel like this is the future for me. So this article really spoke to me.
That's fascinating. I have a follow-up question related to how you're thinking about that. But before I get there, I'm curious, what else did the article say related to identifying valuable traits?
Sure.
Does he give some kind of framework for thinking about value?
While most people search for in-demand skills, top learners search for rare and valuable skills. So he's just got some examples. Amateur learners focus on popularity as a proxy for value and ignore rarity. Professional learners add rarity and focus on true value. Becoming an amateur is not a stop on the way to becoming a learning pro. It is actually fundamentally different path and way of thinking. And this what I thought was so cool. This really reminded me of like Stephen Pressfield, where he talks about going pro, where it's not necessarily that in order to get pro, you have to go through the path of being an amateur. In reality, like 95% of the people go through this amateur path, and there's a small minority of people that go straight to this like highly rare and valuable path. And that made me think, because I've always been a believer in like pay your dues, go through the process. And I think the way he says it is a little bit of an oversimplification. It's not that binary, but even still, it hit a mark with me. Okay, here we go. This is the good part. How do we find rare and valuable skills? Get started with 4 simple rules of thumb. First, it's really hard to beat the market. He's talking about finances, but just assume the market as like the skills market, right? As I said, in financial markets, 90% of professionals, investors do not beat the market. The same is true in many other markets. Okay, second, it means being misunderstood for a long time. This is the hard part, because you got to have the stomach for it. You know, like I remember for years and years and years in an industry like healthcare, where so much of it is still based on like referrals and insiders and doctors referring to each other, believing without a whole lot of evidence, by the way, that when people are searching for intimate services such as addiction treatment or even stuff like, you know, like sexual problems, they go to the internet, you know. And like Viagra was another example of that. I used to look at Viagra and think to myself, like, people are doing this on the internet because they're a little bit embarrassed and ashamed by it. And so that was one of the beliefs I had about addiction treatment. And it was hard to not have any evidence for it and still be all in on it. So that's the real where the rubber meets the road. In addition, it's extremely time consuming. Yes, absolutely. Finally, it's confusing. When one first starts with the Outlier algorithm, it can be hard to find rare and valuable skills. The consensus view is often so entrenched that we are even blind to the idea that there could be another credible perspective. That was the bam moment for me, because everybody does what everybody does, and you see what everybody does and you think it's what you should be doing. And so like, it's so confusing to go the other route without a whole lot of evidence that your route is actually the more direct path to success. Yeah, man. And after reading this, it really, really hit me. It's not that rare and valuable to build an audience anymore. It is super, super rare and valuable to figure out how to provide such value that they buy shit. Because we talked about before, Justin Timberlake, a couple million followers, right? Can't sell books. And so
Can't sell books.
yeah. And so like it's just it hit me, man. I had like a revelation. I'm telling you, this trip in Miami has been really good for me. And I'm like really excited about learning these new rare and valuable skills.
Okay, so I like this a lot. I always am a fan of stumbling across a new piece of content that like unlocks new ways of thinking. I have a couple of opinions on some of the things that he said, which I'm going to throw them out here just to battle test this a little bit for people. So I don't know that I would agree with the statement that it's hard for that it means, what was it? It means being wrong for a long time or being seen as wrong. Is that what he said? Being wrong for a long time?
Yeah.
Let's dig into this one because I think there's something interesting here for anybody who's thinking about this through a business standpoint. One of the things that we had said on this podcast a couple of weeks ago was like, if you're looking to build an audience-based business, there's kind of a framework. Step one, cash flow. Step two, trust and influence. Step three, products.
Monetization, yeah.
So I think I get what he's getting at, but I would temper it with a couple of add-ons, which is this. First of all, if you find a really valuable skill, like I think you've actually stumbled on real value when you're not being told that you're wrong. Like if you were to go to somebody right now and tell them, I can tell you how to start making money on your audience, and like I am the expert in conversion, there's zero people on the planet who's going to be like, Tim's out of his mind. Like that's not what businesses need these days. Anybody who thinks that that's wrong is crazy. So if you're talking about world-changing technologies, I do think you're right. You need to have a stomach for being told that you're wrong because most people, definitely. And to some extent, that might be what he's getting at here. Like if you want that, 100 million X return, like Zuckerberg or Bezos level. In fact, the people that he quoted right up front there, right? Buffett, Bezos, all these people.
Yeah.
So just because a visionary has been proven right for now doesn't mean they can't lose it. And the interesting recent example of this is stock that you can buy that's like a bundle of all these high-tech stocks. It was growing like crazy. People like,
he lost like $50 billion in a day. Yeah, you guys wrote about it a bunch. I know exactly what you're talking about. I can see his face.
Yeah. I don't even know the person, but let's just call it a fund. It was a fund that focused on high-tech stocks. It grew like crazy, I think 300% or something like that. And then obviously with the recent downturn, it imploded. Can you see this in Photoshop?
My goodness, crash and burn.
Yeah. So the top line for everybody listening, or for everybody watching, top line is this, high-tech stock bundle. Bottom line is Berkshire Hathaway. And so he kind of continued with this slow and steady wins the race. So this visionary on the top end was flying high, and then all of a sudden he blew up all the way down and then came back to meet Warren Buffett. And I'm still kind of thinking about this out loud because maybe I'm wrong. At that time, Buffett was considered wrong, right? Because he wasn't buying into all these high-tech things.
Yeah.
So maybe this guy's right, and you do just kind of have to hammer through. But I think the thing that I'm driving at here is I would just caution people, if you're building a business, maybe don't buy into the idea that you're going to have to be proven wrong for years before you see a return. Maybe that's what we should say, because like Buffett's seen a pretty consistent return over time. And I think if you were to get into conversion optimization, you would see a pretty consistent return right out of the gate. And so you, as a business owner, should not look at a lack of success as some indicator that you're like on the right track for some big payoff down the line. You could just be wrong, right? Look for something that is making you money now and will continue down the line. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here.
No, I think you're totally right, because if somebody came to me today, I would still say the best thing that they could do is start a blog. And I think that's probably going to be the case. I still can't see any. It's just like the only thing you ever own on the internet is your domain and your email list, and so like, I don't see that changing anytime soon. So there are tried and true skills that can provide you with the ability to love your work. That's really what we promote here at Copyblogger. You know what I mean? Like, do work that you love and make a bunch of money, because what else could be better? But I think there is still something to continuously being on the hunt to see things that like other people don't see. It doesn't, and by the way, it doesn't necessarily always mean that it's risky, right? Like, I think if I were to read that article, you get the feeling that like, wow, these are just gunslingers that are like, I'm putting all of my money on like Black 36 and just spinning the wheel. It's not necessarily about that. You can take risks in a few different departments, but you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of Jim Collins from Good to Great, where the first chapter is shoot bullets and then shoot a cannonball, where it's you shoot bullets in a bunch of different directions and then you just figure out like my aim is on point, and if I shoot this every time I'm going to hit the target. And then when you do, you know that you can really load up, which I guess looking at in my example, that's very similar to what it was as well. Like, I didn't just start off by seeing this opportunity within this particular industry and building like a company around it. I was writing about my own journey on Sober Nation. Like, I was shooting a ton of bullets in a ton of different directions. And it wasn't until I started writing about certain things that I saw the pattern and I saw the opportunity. And then even then, I didn't quite go all in. Like, I needed a little bit of assurance to go all in. But once I knew that my aim was on target, I went all in. So yeah, I think you're totally right. I guess if we're summarizing it, the article in finance, especially because finance and tech has this like culture of, profits, right? And that's kind of like a bunch of nonsense. The majority of it is just regular people making above average returns, which is what you want. And if you can be on the hunt for opportunities that are looking in a different direction from the crowd, that really is where you can make that kind of life-changing home run. And so I think that still pertains true, regardless of the measured approach.
I like this. What I want to know from you is, how are you thinking about deliberate practice for both the skill of spotting valuable skills and this specific example of becoming an expert in conversion? And I'm putting you on the spot there because I think that's kind of it's a
perfect example, because it's funny. Me and Brian Clark were talking about this a little bit, because he's a little bit more tentative to pull the trigger, and my style has always been like, be willing to fail in public. And so even with things that have like a really solid reputation around it, and maybe I'm a little bit too lackadaisical around it, but even still, if I had to choose one or the other, I would choose my view, where it's be willing to fail and take failure not as failure, but just as data, because that's all it really is. Like, success is actually continuous failures over and over and over again. Like, there's no such thing as like, I made it, like, oh, I did it, I succeeded. It's really not like that. It's just a continuous like herky jerk motion going in a certain direction. And so my deliberate practice is always like I said, maybe a little bit too much, but is always just to go for it and then see what happens. I think that's way better.
Are you into skydiving at all? Are you a skydiver?
I would be if I could be, for sure. I've gone skydiving, definitely. And every single time, I feel like alive. And then 30 minutes later, I'm like, why do I even want to do anything? Why don't I just jump out of planes like for the rest of my life? This is what I want to do.
So this is good. Like, one is kind of inoculate. You have to inoculate yourself to the possibility of failure, and you do that through just like taking repeated shots. And I like that the example you gave, fire bullets than cannonballs. So for me personally, one thing I struggled with is confidence in my own ideas.
Yeah.
And there was specifically one line from Ray Dalio's book Principles that helped me with this, where at some point he said that he realized he had a tendency to be right but early. And I had never thought of those as a potential combination, right?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as he said that, though, I was like, oh, like I had never felt so aligned with something that an investor had said before. But like this concept of being right but early. When I heard that, I started kind of reassessing some of the predictions or bets that I had made in my own life, and realizing, and there's bias to this, right? I'm kind of choosing to focus on the ones that were successful, but this was true for me, and it's probably true for other people who are listening to this. You've probably made bets at some point in your life that were right, but you were just a little bit early, or you didn't stick with it long enough for it to actually pan out. And this is like every entrepreneur has an example of like, oh, I had that business idea. You see some business that gets a bunch of funding or sees some huge exit, and you're like, man, I was thinking about that back in 2008. So that concept was really helpful for me. And then one way that I've taken that into deliberate practice is through like small bets in the stock market. As an overarching rule, I don't buy individual stocks. I have some HubSpot stock because that's part of my employee comp. And then I have most of my money, 99.9% of anything that I'm investing is going into index funds. But I have a very small amount, and I'm talking literally, several $100s that I'll take, and I will frequently move into a company that I think is going to go up and it's specifically for this. It is specifically to develop comfort with making a decision that I don't necessarily have proof for, and then kind of letting it play out over time to see if that was right or wrong. And there was, plenty to suggest. It's not perfect, right? There's a lot of luck that plays into this, but one of the most important skills, and maybe he covers this in the article as well, it's one thing to be able to identify opportunities. You need to be able to take action on them too. And actually, this is something that I learned during the pandemic, because it's literally my job to research trends. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that just because of what I do for work every day, I saw coming and didn't capitalize on. For example, like I was reading research reports on the used car market and how that was basically going to blow up probably April 2020. Wow. Like we were already seeing, because manufacturers been shut down, their parking lots were empty, so you knew like the backlog of new cars coming in was going to drop dramatically. Nobody could have predicted the chip shortage the same way that it probably played out. But long story short, I had a front row seat for the used car market, and then some of these stocks went crazy. Like what was it? Was it CarMax or one of the stocks related to used cars? A used car seller went nuts. When that stock popped off, I realized, I was like, damn it, I was reading about this months ago, and I should have been in a position to do something. And this is when this fundamentally changed my investment thesis. And this is how I now think about opportunities. So there's this idea that, what do they say? Like success is when preparation meets opportunity, right?
Yeah.
It's incomplete. It's right, but it's incomplete. To get success, you need three things. You need to be able to see the opportunity. You need to be in a position to do something about it. And then you need to do something, right? Yeah. Those three things. If you can see an opportunity and you have money on hand, but you don't actually invest, you're not going to see any upside. If you can see an opportunity and you don't have any money on hand, like it doesn't matter, right? Your hands are tied. You can't invest. So in order to capitalize on these rare and valuable opportunities, I think it's helpful to just think through that concept of like, you need to be able to see the opportunity, you need to be in a position to do something about it, and then you need to do something, and then
do something about it.
Yep. And that third one is the hardest one, and you have to look for opportunities to practice it. You look for opportunities to take bets, like you were saying. And I think there's small ways to do it. Like, it doesn't have to be huge, but you kind of inoculate yourself against this possibility of being wrong, and you get used to trusting yourself. And then, you're going to be wrong. You're probably going to be wrong most of the time.
Most of the time.
Yeah. But a couple of them are going to pay off big. And that's all that really matters. You can be wrong. You can be wrong most of the time, as long as you're making the right bets. So I like that. Deliberate practice, take shots, and then build the skill of taking those shots.
It is a skill. Then this is perfect. I think this is the perfect time to sign off. I got to go wake up my kid anyway, but we always come away from these things with like a little bit of a lesson, right? It seems like we just have a conversation, see where it takes us, and then wrap it up with a lesson. And I think for me, one of the things that I have done well, and believe me, I've done plenty of things not well, more so not well than well. But one of the things that I've done well is just been willing to experiment. Through all of that, I've like a website that's about stem cells. Got me totally into this whole other industry that's super fascinating. And, again, 20 years down the line, who knows what that's going to be. I learned all about courses. Now I'm learning about funnels, learned about content marketing. I learned about healthcare, learned about moving. We built a moving website just because so many people were moving across the country. And I saw that and I learned all about that industry. So like, look, you could take this to the bank. Most of what I do fails, but it all kind of stumbles forward into this progression of being at a position where you're confident enough to like just know what you're doing, basically. So if there's a wrap up, it's I definitely see a lot of people being crippled because it's like, what if this doesn't work? And like, let me tell you something, it's probably not going to work, right? Like, it's just probably not going to work. But Nicholas Cole says this a lot, and we got to have him on the podcast one time because he and I finally have to duke it out.
I think we've now said that
incredibly wrong.
Yeah, we've now said that on five different shows. So when this finally happens, it's going to be like the Rumble in the Jungle.
Yeah, but he does say something that I think really, he says volume wins, like volume wins. All the famous artists got famous out of one painting out of like a couple thousand. Edison took 10,000 light bulb shots. So don't be afraid to try and just keep experimenting and keep experimenting. And eventually you'll find that rare and valuable skill that you can basically ride off onto the sunset with.
I like that.
Yeah, me too.
Cool. Well, for everybody listening, thank you for tuning in. Let us know what you think of this new structure. I think we're gonna keep playing with it for a couple of weeks and see how it goes. But the idea is, again, just to bring in new things that we're finding week to week that we're super stoked about, so that you can learn right alongside us. And then, thank you to everybody who's been saying nice things about the podcast, and we'll see you next week.
All right, man. I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for listening, guys. See you soon.